So I want to have some thoughts on sorcery, and particularly on the once a year release, having one set a year or limited sets a year. But right now it seems like one set a year because that's what the company said, and they have said they have no plans to increase that. And they've been fairly adamant about it being one set a year. Now, on different groups and forums and that kind of thing, most people are okay with that, sort of, but also there are other people that want more reprints of beta because of it. But then, there's other people who don't want more reprints of beta. So, is it viable for the company to have just one set a year? And my short answer is possibly, even probably. The real answer is that we don't know, because only time will tell. We don't have an example, I think, of a collectible card game with just one set a year. Just if you look at the pile of failed collectible card games that cropped up as soon as Magic the Gathering came out, when it innovated this whole new way of doing collectibles and a game. These indie, well, they weren't really indie games. They were just basically anyone and everyone in the 90s was making a collectible card game, and they were not putting out one set a year, because that wasn't the goal. Wasn't to, for a lot of them, you could tell that it wasn't to make just enough money to sustain a company, and it wasn't to make a product that would last forever, or that was sustainable. The purpose was basically getting a lot of money as soon as possible, because it was a new trend. At least I would say 90% of the card games in that time period were what people might call cash grabs. Like, this is popular, it's selling, therefore if we do it, we'll make lots of money. That was the motivation. Now, some of them may have thought, we need to make a good game so that we can make more money, or we need to have really good art so we can make more money. But I don't think many of them were thinking, we need to basically have this thing sustain itself for 30 years. And I'm not even sure Wizards was in that mindset at the very beginning. But when it became very popular and they saw it as a sustainable source of revenue, they started thinking about sustainability, especially when they were purchased by Hasbro. Hasbro itself saw it as a cash cow, and it seems like they saw it as, well, at least wanting it to be a perpetual cash cow. So they've done things to at least try, from their perspective, to keep it as a continual source of revenue, rather than an IP that just fails, or an IP that goes out of style, like the 80s cartoon toys that they made, which fell out of style by the end of the 90s, and in the 2000s to 2010, they were basically unimportant to the culture, except, with the early internet, with lots of memes and stuff like that, people making videos of the old G.I. Joe, knowing is half the battle type thing. And then interest started increasing in those old cartoons that we watched when we were kids. And then, live action movies started coming out and more toys started coming out. But I think Hasbro always saw Magic the Gathering as a continual source of revenue if they could manage it well. And you may think that they have managed it well or they haven't managed it well. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, I think that based on their actions, that they weren't planning to have it, just end. right? Why would they buy Wizards if the source of revenue was going to end, right? So Magic itself at some point became seen as a continual source of revenue and a long-term strategy. But these early games that cropped up with the success of Magic didn't necessarily see things that way, because nobody in that time period thought, oh, this is a 30-year industry, right? Even, Wizards and Hasbro, maybe they didn't think it was a 30-year industry, but they'd like it to be. Some of the other games, like, say, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, maybe, I don't know much about their release schedule and the early history of those games. And I think I think you could tie it to, was the game good? Maybe you would think if they put in the effort to make the game good and the art good, then maybe they wanted more than just an in and out. But you can go back and look at all these other card games and you can see a lack of effort put into a lot of them. I think 2 of them are from TSR before it was purchased by Wizards of the Coast. So to go back to Sorcery, like I said, we don't have this example of we're just going to do one release a year, because the goal wasn't to sustain. The goal was to make as much money as you could as quickly as possible, and you can't do that with one release a year. So this suggests that Sorcery, the people behind Sorcery, now that the idea of a 30-year sustainable company is a possibility, it has been a possibility, they do see it that way, and maybe this is their way of doing that. And we don't know that that's necessarily not going to work. But I think right now, like, sales in Sorcery have slowed down to, I'd say, a crawl. There's not a lot of boxes being bought at this point in time, except maybe from, say, Team Covenant, or maybe a little bit on eBay, maybe a little bit on TCG Player. I haven't looked at the sales of the singles on TCG Player because I'm not really a person who often buys singles. So maybe the velocity of those sales are much greater. I have things that I've seen that have suggested to me that is the case. So the secondary market is doing quite well, and people are playing the game. Elsewise, there wouldn't be so many singles being sold, and they wouldn't be at the price that they are, just from collectors or investors. Now, the people that want more beta might be appeased by having more than one set a year, because then they could move their attention from beta to the next set. And the people that don't want beta reprinted, they want to keep their collectability. And they're not just collectors or investors. Some of them are just investors. It's a small amount of people that invest in cardboard, comparatively speaking. And there's a larger amount of people that collect cardboard. And in Pokemon, it's the majority of people who are buying Pokemon are either buying it for their kids or they're buying it to collect, and very few people are playing it in comparison to Magic the Gathering and maybe some other games. So the players are, buying up the singles and playing the game, but that's the thing, is a lot of them are possibly collectors and investors. I would say 80% of players are also collectors, and maybe a tiny portion of the players are investors. Whereas I think people that are investing in cardboard aren't really playing it that much, because they're buying a lot, and they're probably making a lot of money, which means they're probably working long hours at the regular job and don't have time to play the game. Maybe they want to, or maybe they don't. Maybe they just like investing, and a lot of them cross over with collectors. So what I'm getting at is that because we don't know whether more than one set a year is necessary for the game to sustain, there's a lot of evidence that it grows faster with more set releases and more excitement. But we've seen from Dedizu, which was I think the term coined by the first place I heard it was on Kitchen Table TCG, but Medizu is dead, and it had massive growth from its Kickstarter release onward, and then it just stalled out. And so this is the thing that happens with any startup, any new company, is that it can just steadily grow and become a viable company. But more often than not, it's like those 90s knockoff card games or, other card games that didn't come out, that didn't succeed out of the 90s. They latch on to a trend, and the trend itself peters out, but also they grow too fast, and they see that growth as continual, as it's not going to stop growing like that. So then they plan accordingly, and because of that, they produce too much product and acquire too much debt. And then when that trend starts to slow down, or the market itself slows down, like in 2022 and 2023, you're stuck with a bunch of product you can't sell and a bunch of debt that you have to service. And now you don't have the revenue to service your debt, and because of that, you don't have the revenue to create more product, to generate more sales, to service the debt, and then you're stuck with all this product, and that's eating up warehouse space. But the point is, that was stuff that you paid to make, which is more debt, and you haven't sold it, so you haven't seen a return on your investment. So in addition to that, the companies hire a lot of people, and if they're not conscientious, they hire people they don't need to hire. They hire people who are not in any way useful to growth, right? So people who are just getting a paycheck, and they might be great people, but they're not contributing to the sustainability of the company, because it's more important for managers to feel like they've got a large team that they are managing, so they can justify their salaries and so on and so forth. There's lots of reasons why companies hire people that they don't need to hire, and that's more cost. So all their overhead, including their debt, causes them to implode. And that's probably basically what happened to Medizu. And I mean, it's happened to so many different startups in all industries. And it's not surprising that happened with Medizu, and it's not surprising if it's going to happen with another company, and it could happen with any of them. Wizards isn't anymore a startup, so its problems are now the problems of a legacy company, which are similar to, having too much debt, having too much product, that kind of stuff, but also being too large of a company to be able to pivot quickly with market forces, and, having just, a bunch of people in the company that have an expectation of what's supposed to happen, and then, they can't react. There's other things that legacy companies have. Like if a company's 100 years old, it's very difficult for it to sustain itself that long. But if it had been run well for most of those 100 years, it has enough assets and cash to get it through rough times. And that's kind of where Wizards is at. It has, lots of assets and some cash and different IPs and stuff like that, things that are of value. And then they seem to have made recent good decisions by cutting their their inventory, which is very important because that's just, dead weight that is pulling them down further than they already are. So Wizards may very well weather the storm or may fail. I don't know. But getting back to Sorcery, that if it grows too quickly, like MetaZoo did, and acquires, too many employees and too many product lines and that kind of stuff, it's not. I'm not sure if it's in a trend right now because the market in general is down, and card games are down, and it's. I mean, there are still people putting Kickstarters for new card games, and but I think all the time people have been making new card games. But as another example, if we look at Weiss Schwarz and Force of Will, Force of Will was similar to MetaZoo, except that it didn't fail, but it's not anywhere at the level that it was back in 2014, 2015, 2016. And it is just kind of chugging along, and they seem to have, cut their fat out and realized what a sustainable amount of product to put out is, and they're just able to go along. But they're not on any top 10 lists or anything like that, and they're probably not going to be for a long time, if ever. And Weiss Schwarz seems to just always be doing what Weiss Schwarz is doing, and it's doing basically, Universes Beyond, and that's all of their sets, is that they're using a different IP and they're putting out this anime as the card game that they've designed around it, which doesn't look terribly interesting to me as a card game. It's got way too many numbers for power levels. I guess that's an anime thing, so I guess it makes sense. But in any case, I don't think it's necessarily a good game, but it's every single set that comes out is a different, has a different fan base, right? So people dip in and out, I imagine, of Weiss Schwarz based on the animes they like. And maybe there are some people that are buying all Weiss Schwarz sets. I think it's a small number of people. I imagine that it's generally a new customer each time, depending on what IP it is. And yeah, a lot of anime people tend to watch a lot of different shows, so maybe they're buying multiple Weiss Schwarz sets, but I don't think they like every single anime that's out there. And so I think the people that are buying these sets are fans of that anime, and that's sort of Weiss Schwarz model. So in a sense, they're doing one set a year or even less, because if they're appealing to a specific anime, and those anime people don't like any other animes, then they're only buying that one set. And if they make a second version of that set or a follow-up to that set or whatever, then they're buying that, but not any of the other Weiss Schwarz sets. So you could say that it is sustainable to do one set a year. But again, it's not an exact comparison to what Sorcery's planning to do. And the players want more cards out there so that everything isn't so expensive, like the required cards in the meta, right? So far, the puzzle of the set hasn't been solved, as far as I know, of beta. Like, there is no these 2 decks or these 3 decks or these 5 decks are the only decks are the most viable decks, and that's usually how people talk about different sets of Magic the Gathering and other card games and other games in general, that there's a meta to be solved, and when the meta is solved, you need a new set to liven things up, to change things, so that it's not always, everyone's going to a tournament and everyone's playing these same 5 decks. But they often forget that most people are playing at home with their friends, and they're not really engaging with what the solved meta is. A lot of them are doing deck techs, a lot of them are doing net decks, that kind of stuff. But most people are just buying Magic and then playing it with their friends and not paying attention to anything that happens online, really. And I imagine Sorcery, even more so the case, because that's kind of how they geared it as a kitchen table TCG, as opposed to a game that's centered around tournaments and that kind of thing. I mean, it could be competitive and there could be tournaments, but I think they want to focus more on the at-home play and the casual play and the friends getting together in a social place, whether it's at home or at a bar or something like that. So I think that they could sustain one set a year. It's just very strange because there's, stores don't necessarily work on a one set a year type thing, like we're just putting out this one thing. But then again, there's board games that, board game companies that only put out a limited number of board games, maybe once a year, maybe once every 2 years, but those ones are continually in print. And for a collectible card game to survive, you can't keep the only set that's around continually in print. Once there are other sets, you could have different editions that are continually in print, and then other limited release ones. And there is a way to figure out that model, I imagine. So I think that it could stay at one set a year. I'd prefer that it didn't. I'd prefer that it was 2 or 3 sets a year, so that you could have, or at least have like a reprint set every year, like something similar to a revised edition, where or like the first edition, second edition, third edition, fourth edition kind of thing. Like, so these are the cards that we're going to continually print, and then that list is going to change every 2 to 3 years and become a new edition, and those are continually in print. And that, I think, is probably better than just putting out Beta, waiting a year, putting out King Arthur, waiting a year, and putting out the next set. It'd be better to have, a certain number of the cards that are in the previous sets that were printed as reprints in some sort of edition. But, Sorcery or Eric's Curiosa can sustain itself on that because they can plan, they know how much they're going to print, and they have gauged very well so far how much is going to sell, and as long as they only print close to how much they're going to sell, then they can hire accordingly and acquire debt accordingly based on what they know to be true. And because they're not in a trend right now, it's a more steady plane for them to gather data and interpret that data. But once we hit another trend, which inevitably happens, that'll throw a lot of their stuff out the window. And I think most of the data shows that the card games that have survived, that didn't become dead, are ones that had more than one set a year. So, that seems to be the model that works. But we haven't seen a model of one set a year, so we can't say for certain that it doesn't work. Anyway, that's my thoughts on whether or not Sorcery should have one set a year or multiple sets a year. My opinion is that it can have one set a year. We don't know that it can't, but I'd prefer that it had 2 or 3 sets a year. And I don't consider smaller sets necessarily a set. I mean, if a smaller set is half a set, then 2 smaller sets would count as one set to me. But, I mean, I don't know for certain any of this, and no one really does. Eric's Curiosa has more information. Wizards of the Coast probably has the most information, probably is better able to gauge that kind of thing, but can they act on it? They are somewhat too large to turn their ship quickly. That's the metaphor, I guess, works for them. They seem to be turning their large barge with the reduction in their inventory and, the layoffs and they seem to be making a lot of changes, and they seem to have recognized that they're in a bad spot early enough, I think. I mean, it's been 2 years that the bad spot started, they didn't act on it, and they were reacting to the previous 2 years, and unfortunately that was a time of high volume, create as many products as possible and print as much as possible. But I guess we'll know in about a year or two whether Wizards made the right decisions or not, because a company like that, especially with the problems that Hasbro has with their toy lines, they can't survive that long on bad decisions, right? So now with Sorcery, it'll take a lot longer for us to figure out whether or not their model works. I mean, it'll either fail immediately, like King Arthur will come out and completely flop, or it'll chug along for a number of years, but then never grow, or it'll grow steadily and then stop growing, or it'll grow steadily and then go like wildfire. But there's no set number of years that you could say we're going to know the answer to this, because it's not something that's really been done before, at least this one thing of one set a year. So I've spoken for 26 minutes about this, and I'm getting to the point where I'm rambling, or maybe you think I started off rambling, and then I rambled a little bit more, and then I kept rambling, and then it just kept snowballing, and that what I'm doing right now is even worse. So if you think so, tell me I'm a horrible person, and I'll talk to you later.